While growing up gaming during the 1990s, I, along with plenty of others, would be fortunate enough to encounter many cool moments experienced in this great hobby. Perhaps the most surprising of all of these to me though was Xmen vs Street Fighter, the insane tag team fighting game that saw characters from both the Marvel Universe and Capcom Street Fighter face off. I found this insanely cool and beyond anything I could have comprehended. Before that, a Capcom Marvel title I had also played was the fighting game Xmen Children of the Atom, a fun Xmen fighter that features similar mechanics. Unbeknownst to myself at the time, the game even housed a little secret: the inclusion of Street Fighter's Akuma as a secret character. These titles featuring the X-Men that were developed by Capcom were freaking excellent, but little did I know back then was the fact that the Japanese arcade giant had produced a further X-Men game that was exclusive to home consoles. I'm of course talking about X-Men Mutant Apocalypse, a platforming beat 'em up that further celebrated Marvel Comics' most beloved mutated heroes. So without further ado, let's look back at the history of this game, what it brought to the table, along with its place in history now. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the story of X-Men Mutant Apocalypse. Yeah. Prior to the period whereby Capcom in Japan would begin developing Marvel titles, games featuring Marvel characters on home consoles had ranged from average at best to downright terrible. If you saw a game with the likes of Spider-Man or an X-Men license slapped on the front of it, you were not likely to get something particularly special. In the realm of consoles, the first X-Men game the world would receive would be the terrible Uncanny X-Men for the NES. This horrible game, published by LJN, is the definition of a brand cash-in, and its poor quality and inaccurate depiction of the famous characters often helps land this game on the worst NES titles of all time lists. X-Men games on home computers didn't fare much better, with the likes of X-Men Madness in Murder World and X-Men 2 The Fall of the Mutants failing to deliver anything special either. Of course, by 1992 we would get a good X-Men game which would be developed and published by Konami and released in the arcades. But sadly this legendary beat 'em up never made it home during the period, as bloody LJN Acclaim had exclusive rights to release X-Men games on home consoles. Speaking of 1992, Acclaim Entertainment's LJN would publish Spider-Man and the X-Men in Arcade's Revenge for the Super Nintendo, Mega Drive, Game Boy and Game Gear, which despite their many flaws, at least have fantastic music, as the game's soundtrack was composed by the legendary Jeff and Tim Follin. To give you an idea what it was like to work with these Acclaim LJN published games, Richard Kay, who worked at development house Software Creations on the game, states that working on this one was a development nightmare, even going as far as to say that Acclaim was screaming at us and threatening litigation, and we ended up with 3 teams on this one game. Thankfully, this would be the last X-Men game published by LJN, with a period past this point where X-Men games would begin being published by Capcom and Sega. I've already mentioned some of these legendary Capcom titles in today's introduction, but with regards to being trusted to develop these ambitious crossovers in the first place, the groundwork was placed down with the success of The Punisher, a brilliant little 1993 arcade beat 'em up featuring everyone's favourite anti-hero. As for the console version of The Punisher, work would be outsourced to independent American company Sculptured Software. But Mutant Apocalypse would be the first home console Marvel game both published and developed by Capcom in-house. First released in North America in November of 1994 as a Super Nintendo exclusive, due to Sega having their own X-Men publishing agreement, this title would deliver a much higher quality experience than what was associated with X-Men console games of the time. Actually, when I think of high quality, I often think of you, my audience. So if you are finding enjoyment today, it would really help me out if you hit that subscribe button and ring that bell right now. That way you'll receive my uploads on videos like this in the future. Basically, if you don't ask, you don't get. And Big Daddy Top Hat wants to get. Yeah. Anyway, let's carry on discussing the Mutant Apocalypse story. When you look into the people who worked on this project, it quickly becomes clear with regards to why it holds a decent level of pedigree. For starters, it was produced by Tokuro Fujiwara, the same man who holds directorial credits working on iconic titles such as Ghosts and Goblins, Ghouls and Ghosts and Bionic Commando. And all of this is before we take his producer credits into account, producing the likes of Mega Man 2, Sweet Home, and DuckTales. I guess you could say the man is somewhat of a Capcom legend, if we overlooked that he also produced Street Fighter 2010. But hey, none of us are perfect. The game's soundtrack was also in great hands, with Setsuo Yamamoto at the helm, the same genius composer behind the likes of Mega Man X, Street Fighter Alpha, and Rival School's soundtrack, just to name a few. So let's hear a few snippets of the tunes in this somewhat underappreciated Marvel game. Listening back to all of this, it really does have an epic sound to it all, giving off proper Mega Man X vibes in the process. Based off of the classic comic book series echoing the source material, the game opens up with a text sequence that explains that mutant humans possessing incredible powers as a result of genetic mutation are being persecuted by their fellow man for being different. In order to teach mutants to use their powers for the benefit of all, even those who hunted and feared them, Professor Charles Xavier created the Xmen, with the ultimate goal of creating a world where humans and mutants can live together in peace. The story's introductory sequence then brings us to the little-known island of Genosha, where mutants are imprisoned and forced into labour by a brutal army which includes robotic sentinels. There is, however, one evil mind who has far more sinister plans for those captured mutants, the monstrous entity known as Apocalypse, one of the most powerful beings in the Marvel Universe. Professor Xavier orders the X-Men to depart to Genosha to free their fellow mutants, setting up the events of a game. After being advised by the Professor to split up to more effectively disperse the enemy forces, the Professor lays out mission objectives for 5 different X-Men. As indicated by the game's story, 5 different X-Men are playable in this one, each of which are accessible through the game's mission select screen. Speaking of the mission select screen, those who are seasoned Capcom fans will instantly note parallels with the stage select screens that can be found in the Mega Man games, giving players the freedom to tackle levels in whichever order they please. Such a format is not surprising when we take into account that many of the same people worked on this one who worked on Mega Man games previously. Players have a choice of starting the game as either Cyclops, Gambit, Psylocke, Beast, or Wolverine, through each of their accompanying stages. Each character varies from one to the next, with different moves and capabilities being accessible with each mutant fighter. In terms of a full game's layout, just like Mega Man X, each stage must be traversed through with a boss fight taking place at the end of each one. Once all 5 selectable stages have been beaten in any order, there are 3 further linear stages which must be beaten to complete the game, but let's talk more about those shortly. As for each individual playable character's abilities, the Capcom devs have clearly tried their absolute best to mirror what can be found in the comics to the best of their ability. Gambit has the power to manipulate kinetic energy and charge objects with it, allowing him to perform his trademark card throw. Psylocke has her telepathic powers to form psycho knives from her fists. Cyclops can shoot his iconic uncontrollable laser beams from his eyes when removing his visor. Beast possesses ape-like agility and superhuman strength, and Wolverine of course has his super long bitch claws, which he can use to ravage opponents' backs. In terms of the gameplay, as mentioned earlier, the title is primarily a side-scrolling platformer with beat-em-up mechanics. Connecting strikes with enemies can be highly satisfying, with the game's awesome sound effects and solid hit detection, meaning that landing blows is particularly palatable. Here, have a quick listen. Beat 'em up bliss. It's not just the combat that's great though, as generally the graphics are pretty decent too. As Cyclops walked through this woodland area for example, trees can be seen in the foreground to make the aesthetics feel more layered, along with an additional layer of scrolling in the background. Speaking of these layered effects, these are executed particularly well in this train part of the stage, which does an excellent job of presenting a high speed feel. Brilliant stuff! Bosses can often appear bold and vibrant, such as Psylocke's encounter with a Sentinel for example, and the alarm that goes off in Wolverine's stage helps establish an extra layer of urgency. It's artistic choices like this that helps the title feel peak 90s Capcom. On the subject of 90s Capcom, Wolverine's ability to climb walls and perform wall jumps makes his particular stage feel very Mega Man X-like indeed. Certainly something I personally would never complain about, considering that this is one of my favourite games of all time. Thinking about it, I might even go as far as to describe this game as basically Mega Man X to beat 'em up, as it features some very similar play and level design, only with a large number of brawler elements laced in between. Building on such a concept, what would a beat 'em up be without beat 'em up lift sections? Unfortunately, Xmen Mutant Apocalypse delivers in such an area, as you can see demonstrated by this footage of Gambit brawling right here. Did you know it's illegal to make a beat 'em up without a section like this? After eventually beating the levels that can be selected from the stage select screen, the X-Men, under instruction of Charles Xavier, begin to seek out mutants held in a prison. This includes seeing them head underground and the chance to explore an industrial lava-filled stage and take on Tusk. In fact, there is even a stage whereby you must outpace a terrifying wall of lava, a concept I've seen executed in an earlier Capcom game from my childhood, Capcom's Aladdin on the Super Nintendo. It's cool to see stuff developers learned on one project being implemented into another. Eventually, players get to take on Apocalypse. Defeating him and heading towards freeing the prisoners, Xavier's congratulations are interrupted by yet another supervillain, the one they call Magneto, Master of Magnet. Magneto doesn't want to make peace with the island's government, but instead wants to destroy the island, and warns the X-Men to evacuate the prisoners so they don't die like the humans. Prior to the final battle with the self-proclaimed saviour of mutant kind, gamers must test their skills in the Danger Room against Omega Red, and then next, the Juggernaut, bitch. Xavier then locates Magneto in his floating space station known as Avalon. Using teleporters, he transports the X-Men there to confront the big bad. Once in space, in the final throes of the game, players must take on Exodus along with a number of mechanical foe before going one-on-one with Magneto himself. Defeating him leads to the game's ending, whereby they proclaim that violence is never the solution. Which is a bit rich if you ask me, considering that 30 seconds ago they just beat the mutant they were lecturing black and blue. In a cool Easter egg, the X-Men are collected by Professor Xavier, who is accompanied by 5 of the other X-Men, functioning as a somewhat decent completion reward, I guess. Upon release, critics were fairly impressed with this game. Electronic Gaming Monthly, for example, referred to it as the best video game to date based around the X-Men, commenting that stages were large with at points demanding difficulty. GamePro would also respond to the game, concluding that it was a solid hit. In fact, they would even go as far as to compare it to Street Fighter II stylistically, along with praising the graphics and sound. Next Generation, on the other hand, stated that while it would have been nice to see more X people, this game plays great. Nothing revolutionary, but fun. In relation to such an opinion, the fact that this one isn't revolutionary could be the very reason that it doesn't get talked about quite as much as some of the other X-Men games, despite its obvious high quality. The earlier Konami arcade game, for example, was the first ever 6-player beat-em-up. X-Men Children of the Atom established Capcom's superhero tag team fighting game mechanics formula, and X-Men vs Street Fighter will never be forgotten for bringing 2 worlds together that few foresaw ever being associated with one another. Perhaps it is these games' revolutionary natures as to why it is so easy to overlook and forget about Mutant Apocalypse. But from my point of view at least, I think enough is enough and it's time for a change, and we should all begin giving this one the credit it is long overdue. Essentially, if you champion games like Mega Man X or Capcom's Aladdin, a game that controversially in my opinion features much more engaging gameplay than the Mega Drive's flashy looking Aladdin game, then you should in all honesty try and find a place in your heart for Mutant Apocalypse. It is very solid in my opinion and deserves some of your attention. X-Men console games were finally good. Anyway, if you enjoyed this one, check out my video on Saturday Night Slam Masters, Capcom Secret Wrestling Street Fighter Trilogy. Yeah! Cheerio.